Make them feel good here. And whenever you're ready, sir, you can go ahead and begin.
I have important news for every single one of you. It happens to come from Romans 1:16. It reads, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile." In this speech, I will just take you through some of the history, cross-references, a parable that just so happens to fit nicely, and finally, how all of this applies to you. I always like to start things off with a little bit of history. So, Paul is the author of Romans, and he wrote it during the winter of 56 to 57 AD. It was actually written during a mission trip to Jerusalem, as found on Bible.org, paragraph 2. His idea was to preach the spiritual benefit to the Romans and to guide the Romans in their worship. Romans 1:16 just so happens to reveal the righteousness of God very well. And this, through faith, is salvation. This idea is even supported in the Old Testament, which, if you look in your handout, I have some different translations and such for that. As you know, throughout the Bible, many verses happen to tie to one another. Romans is a book that especially ties to many books due to the message that it happens to hold. Mark 8:38 happens to be one of these verses. "If anyone is ashamed of me and my word in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of you when he comes in the Father's glory to the holy angels." The second one happens to be 1 Corinthians 1:18. "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And then, to wrap this up, 2 Timothy 1-12, found in the NIV translation, I think does a good job of wrapping this up. "That is why I am suffering as I am. Yet I am not ashamed, because I know in whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted in him for that day." Those are just simple Bible verses that could tie to Romans 1:16. But there is one parable that Jesus taught that happens to fit nicely with salvation. Suppose you have 100 sheep, and you lose one. Do you not just leave the 99 in open country and search for the one that is lost? And once you find him, you happen to bring him on your shoulders and bring him back home. Then rejoice with friends and neighbors, saying, "I have found my lost sheep." The same goes for heaven. There will be more rejoicing over one sinner than over 99 righteous persons who do not need repentance. As you can see in this, God, he searches for every single one of us. So why should we be ashamed of that message? And finally, to wrap things up today, I have shown you Bible verses, a parable, and a theme of not being ashamed. But how exactly does all this information apply to each and every one of you? For us who believe, God had victory over death. He defeated sin, death, and damnation. He was not ashamed to save each one of us. So why should we be ashamed of his acts for us? That is how that could apply, like I said, to those who believe. But for those who are skeptical or do not believe, I also have news for you. God does not exclude anyone. His doors are always open to new believers. His death was for each and every one of us. It has to be your choice to come to him. And I think John MacArthur wraps this section up very well. So I will play just a little bit of the audio log of one of the question and answers that he was asked.
The gospel, but they'll readily confess it causes them some level of anxiety. Is there a difference between anxiety and shame? And what was Paul's point in that passage?
There is, and that's a well-put question. A difference between anxiety and shame. Sure, of course, we feel anxiety when we confront somebody with the gospel. Why? Because we're saying to this sort of self-possessed person who's trying his best or her best to feel good about himself or herself, look, I got news for you. You are a wretched, corrupt, degenerate, depraved sinner on the way to eternal hell, and you deserve every bit of that. That is not the most encouraging way to start a conversation. But you know what? Sooner or later, that's where we have to go. Because when we're talking to people about being saved, the question is saved from what? Not from a lack of purpose in life, but from everlasting hell, which we're due because of our sin. So we would assume anxiety. We need to overcome that because we don't want to be ashamed of the gospel.
As you've seen, Romans 1:16 happens to have a very powerful message. I hope that you have learned some of the history, some verses that happen to cross-reference it, and a parable that Jesus taught, and how all of this information can just so happen to apply to you. I hope that you feel God's calling and never are ashamed of the gospel.
Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you very much.